concluding session, which Marilyn and I are going to joint chair. It's called New Directions, New Models. And the idea behind this session is that we consider the prospects of the academic book in the Global South. We consider new directions in authorship, publishing and reading of the academic book. And consolidate some of our discussions around considering new models of publishing in these regions, the effectiveness of open access publishing models, and consideration of the impact of digital projects. So, very much thinking here about how the academic book might alleviate rather than accentuate global inequalities in knowledge production and distribution in the arts and humanities in the future, and thinking about how new technologies of mixed media can enhance or impede access. So, these are sort of a forum really for thinking about maybe more positive ways forward and consolidating some of our ideas over the rest of the conference. So, first of all, we have two exciting papers, which I'm really looking forward to. And then there's a panel discussion later on where all of our speakers will return and sort of make some concluding comments about what they've got out of the conference and where what they would like to see coming from this in the future. How we're going to organise these two talks is a little different from how we've organised the previous ones, in that Abhijit and Padmini would like to have, I think I'm right in saying this, let's give your papers and then come back together for a longer discussion period. So if you can just hold your questions, that would be great. So I'd like to start by introducing Professor Abhijit Gupta, who is Professor of English at Jadavpur University and Director of Jadavpur University Press. So he's coming here as both academic and publisher, so I think that will be fascinating. He's co-editor of the Book History in India series, of which 3 volumes are now out. And he and his team have created an electronic bibliographic database and location register of Bengal books from 1801 to 1914, which is the first such initiative in a South Asian language. So, sorry, Bengali books. So thank you very much, Abhijit, and over to you for your paper. Thank you.
Let me begin by saying what a pleasure and a privilege it has been to be present at in these 2 days of the conference. I've learned a great deal, and I really thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me and for the wonderful hospitality which we have experienced. And I've been, as I said, very grateful to be listening to many of the papers and about areas and about initiatives about which I knew very little. And many of these papers have been eye-openers in the way in which various organizations and individuals have been working in very adverse conditions to conserve the culture and the textual, visual materials of which are endangered or vulnerable. My presentation is I must begin my presentation with a slight caveat that it might seem to go against the grain of the theme of this panel somewhat, new directions and new models. I will be talking about fairly traditional models, but also, paradoxically, a model of publishing which is new in our part of the world. So while it may be traditional, both in form and content, as I will try and show you, it also has a kind of a kind of newness in the way in which we are trying to do things. So without further ado, much of what I will talk about partakes of older and more traditional modes of knowledge and book production, especially in light of my recent experience in running a nascent university press. At the same time, the pull of newer directions and models are more compelling than ever before. Yesterday, we heard from Shrukanta Chaudhary about new initiatives in creating digital archives by organizations such as the School of Cultural Texts and Records in Jadavpur University and the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, both in Calcutta. The Bichitra Tagore Varioram project led by Professor Chaudhary is an example of pioneering work not just in digitizing print and manuscript, but also in creating digital and computational tools for textual analysis. We also heard about the digitizing initiatives of the Government of India under the rubric of the Digital Library of India. There are more such projects in the pipeline, such as the 2 Centuries of Indian Print project led by Noor Sobers Khan of the British Librarian, of which both panelists, Padmini and I, are collaborators. These are the new directions and new models of knowledge production in South Asia. In such a context, to talk about university press, run very much along traditional lines, might seem to be willfully perverse on my part. But I hope to show that there is still a scope and rationale for an imprint such as ours. To begin with, it might be useful, and here I'm sort of wearing my book historian hat for a while, to recapitulate certain historical trajectories of what we might call the academic book in South Asia. And I again refer to the colonial period and the post-print period, the knowledge production through manuscript, through the manuscript method in seminaries across India for millennia is not really within the scope of this paper. I'm looking at 3 broad categories or 3 groups of bodies which carried out the production of academic knowledge in the colonial India. First, societies of learning and letters, such as the Royal Asiatic Society, which published over 300 scholarly books under the rubric Bibliotheca Indica from 1849 onwards. From the late 19th century, a number of indigenous societies of letters entered the scene with their own publishing program, such as the Bongyo Sahitya Porishad in Bengal, established 1893, or the Nagari Pracharani Sabha in Kashi, also established in the same year. In contrast, the 3 presidency universities, Bombay and Calcutta and Madras, set up by the Raj, chiefly concerned themselves with publishing textbooks and ancillary materials for the college list, though the Calcutta University Press kept up a vigorous program of book and periodical publishing through much of the 20th century. The third group, again, I'm this is a very broad brush and a very quick kind of a review of the various players. The third group consisted of overseas publishers, beginning with Oxford University Press, and later the likes of Macmillan and Longman. Rimi Chatterjee has reported on the activities of both OUP and Macmillan in the Indian subcontinent. While the primary revenue of these firms came from the textbooks market, Chatterjee has described how a firm such as the OUP put into place some of the early protocols of scholarly publishing in India. According to her, the bulk of scholarship on India published by the press from roughly 1890 to 1910 comprised 2 main categories: antiquarian or Indological works and works on the contemporary Indian systems. The Indological list, authored by the likes of Max Muller, Monia Williams, E.B. Cowell, among others, consisted of translation of sacred and ancient books, scholarly disquisitions on ancient culture, and texts of comparative religion from a European standpoint. The other, i.e. the administrative group, produced histories, gazetteers, anthropological and ethnographical texts, geographies, and travel books. By the early 20th century, Indian firms such as Motilal Banarsidas, set up by an ex-OUP employee to publish Indological books, or the Bombay-based Popular Prakashan, set up by Ramdas Bhatkal to publish a social science list, had also ramified in these 2 directions. At the same time, it must be remembered that the market of pre-independence India was largely an undifferentiated one, with the same publisher publishing for both the academic and trade sectors. So you would see that all these publishers that I've named would actually be publishing both for the academic as well as the trade lists. Post-independence, Indian scholarly publishers began to enter the market, specializing in one or the other of the 2 categories described above. Thus, a firm like Munshi Ram Manohar Lal, established in 1952, specialized in Indology, while Peter Jayasinghe's Asia Publishing House, set up just before independence in 1943, was noted for its social science and humanities list. The meteoric rise and fall of Asia Publishing House is a particularly interesting case study. Probably the first Indian publisher, and I'd say probably, arguably, to publish along professional lines, APH published a staggering 4,300 titles in the 3 decades from the 40s to the 70s. According to Philip Altbach, who's researched this, the rise and fall of APH shows both the strength and weakness of Indian publishing. Asia proved that it is possible to build a large firm by combining the import and distribution of foreign books with the publishing and distribution of Indian books. At the same time, the post-independence Nehruvian command economy and consequent restrictions on foreign equity meant that overseas firms would have to scale down their operations. This is effectively what happened with Macmillan and Longmans, which then restricted itself to the textbooks market and more or less abandoned scholarly publishing altogether. OUP, however, owing to its status as a charity, managed to carry on and even scale up its businesses, especially under the leadership of such editors as R.E. Hawkins, Samuel Israel, Charles Lewis, Girish Karnad, Ravi Dayal, and Rukun Advani up to the 90s. But what about the universities or university presses? The spread of universities across the country post-independence did not lead to a proportional rise in academic publishing across campuses. In the case of Vishwabharati, the university set up by Rabindranath Tagore, and Vishwabharati Granthana Vibhag, its publishing wing, which was set up in 1923, is a very different and a unique category. Most of the publications of Vishwabharati Granthana Vibhag was the output of one man, Rabindranath Tagore, and much of the later books are either on Tagore or by his immediate circle. So it occupies a somewhat anomalous position in this history. Now, the reasons for the university press not really taking off in India, these are complex, but it is my tentative suggestion, very, very tentative indeed, that the task of nation building and creating citizens for the new republic became the preoccupation of Indian economy, Indian academy. Thus classroom teaching and not publishing became the chief focus of college and university teachers. In such a scenario, only a handful, perhaps those with a burning desire to say something, would publish in books and periodicals, often at financial cost to themselves. It was only in the 90s that the University Grants Commission of India began to encourage academic publishing by setting aside funds for publishing in its what is known as special assistance program for departments. But the rules of availing such funds remain so Byzantine that they're often disincentive to publishing, something I will return to later. Now, this is a very, as I said, a very rough and ready, and perhaps there are many arguable points about this picture that I've very hastily sketched. But now I wish to talk about the more specific instance of the university press that I am associated with. The setting up of Jadavpur University Press about 4 years ago, after, of course, a decade of being in gestation, about various discussions, good intentions, but eventually it finally took off the ground in 2012. At a time when university presses worldwide were either downsizing or reinventing themselves. Now, the university where I teach was founded in 1956. It's a fairly new university, state-aided public university in the state of West Bengal, which initially began life as an engineering institute, and the humanities and social sciences began to come into their own from the 60s or 70s, becoming the humanities particularly becoming very extremely productive in the 80s and 90s. So the publication program that it had was restricted to journals, departmental journals, that most of the departments in the arts faculty, the humanities faculty had, again with assistance from state funds. So there was a budgetary allocation for journals which was provided to these departments. Now, with one or two exceptions, the model of contracting with a commercial publisher for journals, common in the West, is not common in the Indian universities. Most departmental journals are published under the imprint of the respective college university, usually under the hand of the registrar or senior administrative official. This, on the other hand, while this has ensured that the prices of such journals remain affordable, so for instance, from my experience at the Calcutta Book Fair, which is the biggest retail book fair in the world and where the university has a stall every year, we find that there is a bigger sale from the university stall, or in fact not in monographs, but back issues of such journals, 20, 30 years. So we have a stream of, mostly bought by students and researchers, who constantly come in and buy back issues of these journals at fairly low prices, and these were very low price to begin with. So on the one hand, while this has made scholarship accessible to younger researchers and scholars, there have also been compromises in quality. It is only very recently that some concessions towards peer reviewing are being made in the Indian periodicals market. But here too, the system is by no means foolproof. As university hiring in India moves towards a deplorable point system, which, as Professor Chaudhary described yesterday, the notorious API, the Academic Points Index, there is increasing pressure on would-be university lecturers to publish in journal with ISSNs. That's a kind of, if you have an ISSN, then you get certain points, leading to a small industry of such journals, mostly of dubious quality, in print, but mostly in online formats. Now, in such a scenario, what can a newly set up university press with very limited funds and workforce hope to achieve? Over the past 4 years, Jadavpur University Press has published 30 odd titles in 4 chief categories: translations, anthologies of essays in various hands, critical editions and monographs, and a couple of crossover titles. But this, again, has been largely accidental. This has not so much been a result of deliberate planning than a reflection of the resources often available to the university community. Thus, many of our early titles were pre-selected, as it were, by the funding protocols of the University Grants Commission, which is notorious for remitting funds in the last quarter of the financial year and demanding that they be utilized by the end of the financial year. So while one can perhaps buy computers or even books for libraries in such short order, one can imagine what chaos might ensue if one were to publish for such a schedule. Get the money in February, you have to publish by June. Added to this was the bureaucratic necessity of providing competitive quotation from printers, and then having to justify why a typescript was not being sent to the lowest bidder for printing. I had to write long notes explaining why the highest bidder was being given the particular book to print. Only 1 year of this experiment cured us of any further desire to depend on funding from the University Grants Commission. At the same time, we were also too painfully aware that such funds which still had to be spent were now making their way into the pockets of commercial publishers who cheerfully undertook to deliver a finished product from manuscript to book in 3 months or even less. I need not spell out the compromises in quality that are tolerated in this process. Since 2013, then, the press has been supported by financial support from the university and from its own meager earnings. In a sense, we have been a small independent publisher pretending to be a university press. As I've mentioned at the beginning, we have been working with very traditional modes of bookmaking. We have small print runs of between 500 to 1,000. We mostly print in hardback, and we do not have any electronic editions as yet. I'm going to come back to this in a bit. Our distribution is likewise carried out through retail outlets largely based in the city of Calcutta. We have a full-time staff of exactly 2 people who have to do everything around the press, from copy editing to heavy lifting, from cover designing to painting book fair stalls. Now, anyone who has run a small press will be familiar with this model. In India, a number of such small presses have also published some of the finest books in recent times. So one thinks of Seagull, which is no longer very small. Seagull Books sends 3 publishers, Feminist Press in Calcutta, Tara Books in Chennai, Zuban Women's International, and Yoda Press in New Delhi. Many of these presses specialize in areas such as women's studies, Women's International 3, theatre, Seagull, the crafts, Tara Books, and so on. But despite running a publishing house based on such a model, I must also say that such a model is not sustainable in the long run. While some of these presses have managed to soldier on for 2 or 3 decades now, there are now indications that it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to do this on their own. Over the past 1 year, at least 2 of the above presses, which I've mentioned, have teamed up with multinational presses in starting co-branded imprints. The small presses provide the editorial input and the final copy, while the larger firm produces and distributes through their own extensive channels. So this is one model which has suddenly become the flavor of publishing, and it's very much a work in progress. In such an arrangement, the smaller partner is usually treated as an author with payments made in royalties. Now, this arrangement appears on the surface to benefit both parties. The small press saves costs on production. In any case, there would have been very small print runs, and does not have to worry about distribution. The larger firm makes savings on the editorial costs. In fact, many of these multinational firms are now divesting from editorial costs, either employing freelancers or completely outsourcing it to these firms who actually supply high-quality copy to them. Now, it is too early to tell whether such a model is beneficial for the smaller firm. We too have experimented with such a model, and we're in the process of doing so. I can tell you about this in the form, because it's public knowledge, in the form of one of our crossover titles, which is a graphic anthology of short fiction by Rabindranath Tagore. So we had taken 13 short stories, asked 13 artists to do comic book versions of the stories. This is due out in early 2017, which we are co-publishing with HarperCollins India. Talks are on with another firm for a list rather than a one-off, where we're actually talking of a co-branded list. These titles are all in the English language, of course, but it would be premature to speak any more about this because it's still not a done deal. Model is very much work in progress, and its benefits yet to be assessed. But again, I mean, when we were approached by this very large firm with this proposal, I mean, we had obvious misgivings. But again, it's not something which we are going to do on a case-to-case basis, and which we really cannot assess the benefits or otherwise, unless we get into it. So working with HarperCollins so far has been, but owing to personal friendships and contacts, quite hassle-free. But what a sustained relationship with a very large big brother, as it were, would turn out for a small press, to what extent it would impinge on autonomy, is something which is very much in the realm of the future. But it seems to be a kind of a model which is beginning to slowly find acceptance in the English language Indian publishing market. However, I'll speak with somewhat greater confidence about the other direction that the press might take. Again, I qualify by might, and it might come as a surprise given the direction that we have taken so far. So far, our university press has been fortunate in receiving financial support from the university in terms of salaries, infrastructure, and some support towards the production of titles. It has been even more fortunate in having been able to function with a certain degree of autonomy. But a time perhaps must come sooner or later when the ways of the university and the university press will diverge. At this nascent stage, it can still, though with difficulty, function with part-time and unpaid for labor, friends and well-wishers, many of whom carry out various tasks for the press without any payment. But as it grows, if it grows, the press must acquire a full-time director or publisher, more staff, and more importantly, financial autonomy. And when I say financial autonomy, for instance, let me give an example of how there are certain restrictions that we face. For example, the press is not able to collect payments online. And its attempt to sell online through e-retail organizations have also been beset with bureaucratic hurdles. Again, the fact that there is no precedent for this kind of press running in Indian universities adds to the unfamiliarity of university administrators with what to do with it. We're neither a teaching department, we're neither a research department. What do we do then? Do we make money for the university? We at least try to. And since there are no such models in other universities, the university of administration has nothing to fall back on as a precedent. But if the press survives, it is my opinion, it must do so only by severing the umbilical cord of the mothership, though some, including myself, might argue that the university press should be as indispensable a part of university as its classrooms, libraries, and infrastructure. In other words, it should be tasked with disseminating the research which is carried out at the university. But that is perhaps too wildly utopian for our times. Already some of my university officials have begun to gently hint how we should be doing a few textbooks in order to subsidize our more scholarly publications. But again, that is difficult to do because we can produce textbooks, but who is going to sell them? Who is going to distribute them? The moment you get into distribution, you have to tie up with a larger distributor who will eat all your profits. We have tentatively explored such options, and none of these has been satisfactory. So here's the broad direction we intend to adopt: a mix of print and electronic editions. Print only for those titles which have a sufficiently wide reader base, or say facsimile editions, or those where the very nature of print is an artifact. Printed book as an artifact is key to the reading. But for books which have a more niche readership, such as the monograph or conference proceedings, the costs of print production are simply too prohibitive. Also, sales of such titles are fitful, and it takes several years to clear an edition, if at all. This has, in a sense, also been the bane of state-funded scholarly publishing in India. While the UGC has provided funds for publication, the resultant piles of books that are published remain unsold over years, even decades, gathering dust in university warehouses. Much the same applies to the printed academic journal. Every year, every department of my university publishes a journal. But again, heaps of that, because there are no distributors, they just lie in cupboards in the university. Now, even Vishwabharati, about which I had spoken earlier, they have only 2 retail outlets, one in Shantiniketan and one in Calcutta, though they have a formidable backlist. They do not sell online. As of this morning, I visited the website there. They say that we plan to sell online very soon, but it's still any day now. That's 1923, so they've been around for a while now, about 100 years. So it seems that the way forward for such scholarly productions, such as the monograph, the academic journal, should be to transform into a born digital format with provisions for print on demand. Of course, I'm saying nothing new that has not been said over these 2 days. For a small press such as ours, dependent on university support, such a step would enable us to save on production and perhaps spend on peer review, rights, copy editing, proofing, design. However, there are some resistances to be taken into account, especially on part of authors who might be reluctant to be published in a born digital format. Likewise, a large section of our target readership, especially in Bengali, we publish both in Bengali and English, would still prefer print over the electronic version. In fact, over the last decade or so, a number of small publishers have emerged in the Bengali language market. The quality of its book production has been much superior to that of the more established publishers, who have often compromised on production values to keep costs low. As a result, the Bengali reader has begun to show a discernment and preference for well-produced books, giving the printed book an additional cachet. On the other hand, our difficulties in reaching readers outside Bengal, and especially overseas, could demand a digital imperative. What about other Indian universities? Regrettably, there are no indications that universities in India are contemplating their own imprints, other than the Ambedkar University Press, which seems to be setting up an imprint of its own. So Jadavpur University Press may well remain an anomaly in the landscape of Indian scholarly publishing. But I still hope that our experience in setting up such a press on more or less a shoestring budget might serve as either a model to emulate or a foolhardy enterprise to be avoided at all costs. The jury is still out on this, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. That was fantastic and so interesting, and complements what we heard about African scholarly publishing so well. So thank you very much. So our second speaker is Padmini Ray Murray, who is, just to reiterate, we'll have lots of question time afterwards, so that's great, who is currently a faculty member of the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, where she's launching a master's program in the digital humanities, the first of its kind in India. Padmini, until 2014, was a university lecturer in Stirling University in publishing studies in digital media. She was also a trustee of Wikimedia UK, which she talked to us about a little yesterday, and vice chair of Global Outlook Digital Humanities, also editor of Sharp newsletter and managing editor of Digital Humanities Commons. So thank you very much, Padmini. Right, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and it's been brilliant to come back to the UK and see old friends and colleagues, and to have familiar faces here. And it's been such an honor and a privilege to hear from so many erudite minds from all over the world and familiarizing us with their contexts, which are so similar yet different from ours, and kind of help shed a different light on what we're experiencing in our own country. When I was asked to give this talk, I was slightly alarmed because I am a book historian, and the contemporary book in India was not something that I was hugely familiar with, especially since I've only been back in the country for a year. So I did ask some good friends to help me out, and I think one thing that became immediately apparent is that there isn't much data on the ground at all. And I think in a sense that might inform my talk in that the need for publishing studies and book history as disciplines need to embed themselves further in the Indian landscape. I myself was very fortunate to go to Jadavpur, where both Shrikanta Chaudhary and Abhijit Gupta were mentors of mine, and was made familiar with the history of the book in the early 2000s. But it doesn't really, as far as I know, exist anywhere else in India. And given the shape and the trajectory of how the publishing industry is developing, I think it's a shame that there is not more scholarship around that. Nielsen, our great friends, do have presence in India where they do some forms of data collection, but it represents something like 30% of the market, because the market itself is not very organized. So there is definitely a deep need for students to be looking more closely at the publishing industry in India. There's a friend of mine in the audience who's doing some work under Francesca Orsini, and there are some younger scholars at SOAS who I know are doing some great work in this area, but much more is needed. Again, book historian context, so I'm going to give a bit of historical context to what I'm talking about. I'm going to be trying to make a case for the fact that the academic book, Abhijit's argument notwithstanding, is a colonial construct that we don't necessarily have to subscribe to in the future. I think I made some of my arguments yesterday, but I'll continue in my paper today. As early as 1792, the superintendent of the East India Company's trade activities, evangelist and erstwhile military man Charles Grant, articulated a justification for introducing Western knowledge, values, and English education to India in his observations of the state of society among the Asiatic subjects of Great Britain, particularly with respect to morals and the means of improving them. Grant's proposal was as follows. The true cure of darkness is the introduction of light. The communication of our light and knowledge to them would prove the best remedy for their disorders, which Grant described as ignorance, and which later his proponents Curzon and Baden-Powell used as basis for their declarations denouncing the lack of integrity of their Indian subjects. And if this remedy is proposed from a full conviction, and that if judiciously and patiently applied, it would have great and happy effects upon them, effects honorable and advantageous to us. The narrative of how such ideological formulations underpinning a colonial agenda shape the basis of school and higher education in India are now well rehearsed. The work of scholars such as Gauri Vishwanathan, Harish Trivedi, and Priyamvada Gopal have argued how these were hegemonic interventions enlisted by the British to perpetuate their rule and create a bureaucratic workforce that would enable them to do so. Others such as Alok Mukherjee and Radhika Parameshwaran have gone to demonstrate how these hegemonies still resonate in post-independence India, granting cultural capital to a high caste elite, although, as Mukherjee also proposes, and I quote, English is the terrain on which women, Dalits, and other people with a transformational agenda, for example, are waging their own wars of position in the name of broadening the English curricula, changing them, making them inclusive, and or applying different critical frameworks. The entry of British publishers such as Macmillan, Orient Longman, and Oxford University Press in the early 20th century meant that both school and higher education sector was largely dominated by their publications, especially in the absence of a local publishing industry producing texts which were suited to the mandate of the curricula dictated and imported by the British. While Indian publishers began to break the stranglehold imposed by these publishers on the textbook market in the 1940s, as Abhijit has already suggested, and the post-independent era saw the growth of an educational market that commissioned work by local authors, British publishers continued to be significant players through their subsidiaries, branches, or through licensing and special arrangements with other Indian publishers and distributors. In addition to this, a joint Indo-American agreement signed in the early 1960s allowed subsidized reprints of American books to be published and sold in India, opening the floodgates to a steady stream of American titles, especially in the STM sector. The immediate aftermath of independence witnessed an eschewing of English as a language of instruction, and anti-colonial rhetoric couched it as a foreign language, but the alternative proposed, that of Hindi, was violently opposed by those in the South, who were heirs to an entirely different linguistic tradition, which led to the language riots of the 1960s. This tension between the proposition of English as a universal linked language and retaining the integrity of local and regional languages is still a crucial and contemporary debate, and sets the stage for my argument that the academic book is largely a colonial construct, that the sites of enactment of sustained arguments, cultural debates, and critiques occur elsewhere, rather than in the single author monograph, which still occupies a significant space in Anglo-American academia. Professor Chaudhry, in his opening talk yesterday, gestured at one of these significant differences when he proposed, I quote, a model which involves a wider social sharing in the materials of knowledge through the participation of informed or even not so informed members of the greater cultural community. Just to remind you of what he said, the print culture of several Indian communities, Malayalam, Bengali, or Marathi for a start, is constructed on some variety of this model. Its most tangible manifestation is surely the Kolkata Book Fair, which Abhijit mentioned, where it's a poor day that does not draw 30 or 40,000 visitors, only a fraction of them professional academics or even students. In such a milieu, the world of the non-professional serious reader, the amateur scholar in the non-pejorative sense, grades into that of the professional academic scholarship. So I wish to extend Professor Chaudhry's argument by demonstrating the different trajectory that intellectual knowledge can and has taken in India, especially in Indic languages, due to the unique specificities of its public sphere. Pre-digital print culture in the major Indian languages has had a long, venerable, and vibrant tradition of publishing little magazines and journals that straddle the worlds of the academic and the amateur, or what we might now call the citizen scholar. At this point, it might be worth indulging in some taxonomic hair-splitting. The sort of content that these magazines publish would in the UK probably qualify as non-fiction for the interested lay reader, and probably the sort of writing that publishers are taking less and less risks with, given that it would cater to a rather esoteric audience. So I'm thinking here of, say, Z Books, who are very, very niche, but very good at what they do. But they would definitely be considered distinct from academic. And I think we're all aware that these terms exist to make it easier for booksellers and publishers to conceive of their market as segments. But the point that I wish to make, that by no means are these categories universal to all parts of the world. I have a brief anecdote to illustrate my point. A friend's father is one of India's leading experts on deluge. And he has recently retired from a professorial post. And he's based in Kerala, where he writes in Malayalam. And he publishes his scholarship in magazines and literary journals. And it is only recently that a publisher has stepped forward to compile an anthology of his essays. And deluge, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is fairly dense and difficult reading. And yet he has quite a wide readership in these literary journals. Obviously, one of the biggest differences of this model from the sort that characterizes work coming out of, say, British universities, is that publication goals are essential to fulfill in order to conform to the pressures of the ref and to advance one's academic career. This is now also increasingly the case in India, as both Professor Chaudhary and Abhijit have mentioned. The University Grants Commission has become much stricter about the criteria that needs to be fulfilled for promotion at public universities. And there is a point system in place that is heavily weighted towards peer-reviewed journal articles, followed by monographs. This shift has definitely created a seller's market, and Indian subsidiaries of multinational companies such as Oxford University Press are keen to capture this market. Unfortunately, as we've gathered from discussions both yesterday and today, these procedures are only serving as impremature granting activities, which facilitate younger scholars to get permanent positions or promotions, but the knowledge that they're producing remains inert. There's very little effort on the parts of these publishers to sell foreign rights to these works, despite the fact that there might be a large market for them abroad. Post-colonial studies, for example, is by now quite a fixture on American and British university syllabi. What scholars both in India, but no less elsewhere, should be trained to do, just in the way we learn how to present cogent and coherent arguments or to conform to style guides, is to learn how to harness digital tools and to publish our work online in meaningful ways. Library budgets are shrinking everywhere, encountering financial pressure from subscription packages, and there is no guarantee that the considerable labor produced for a monograph will have an afterlife unless disseminated in other, possibly more generative ways. I feel there are lessons to be learned from the sort of intellectual and give and take that I've referred to earlier, that fruitful exchange between non-fiction authors, for example, and their audiences. The Indian language blogosphere, for example, is a rapidly expanding and active space for conversations pertaining to literature, history, and politics. And one of our colleagues, Tanmoy Bir, has shown the extensive nature of Bengali blogs. He stated that they exist in different forms. They can be both in print and online, but also just available online. They might be available for subscription or payment or for free. But this is the kind of gamut that's covered by the Bengali blogosphere, which is vast. And by vast, kind of just some figures, 52 diasporic Bengali literary journals are published out of America. There's something close to 200 that he's managed to count coming out of West Bengal and Bangladesh. And there are many countries that have diasporic communities that are contributing in great volumes to these blogs. And I think that the blogosphere, especially when it comes to the literary journal or the cultural journal, is something that we've left out of our calculations and understanding of what it means to be publishing academically in India or in Indian languages. It is important to flag up at this point that my concerns are not only restricted to that of language, but also to that of the wider question of what comprises the humanities and social sciences in the Indian academic context today. Universities provide a theoretical foundation for students which are largely inherited from a Western intellectual tradition, and it is only recently that there has been a concerted effort to provide students with more locally relevant and alternative conceptual frameworks by which to understand the world. Dhruv Raina, in his Reimagining the University after the Yashpal Committee report, questions the very idea of the 19th century University of Culture as an ideal for contemporary times, pointing out that the era of the Humboldtian University or the University of Culture was the result of simultaneous revolutions in the cognitive, intellectual, and institutional realms. He observes that today, the modes of knowledge production have changed drastically, necessitating the reimagining of the university as an institution. It has been pointed out that English education originally was basically seen as useful education, even when it dealt with literary texts and the Bible, an education whose use was mainly to get into the administrative service, and the contradictions between the educational goal of knowledge for its own sake and useful knowledge had little purchase in the Indian context, even during nationalist times. Sanjay Seth attempts to forward an explanation in his book Subject Lessons. He poses the question of how Western knowledge acquired the current status in India of being the only mode of knowledge from many other modes of knowing. And in his book, he examines the consumption and the reception of this modern Western knowledge in an Indian context. Locating his analysis along the lines of a Foucauldian project of, quote, the history of knowledge, which constitutes a privileged point of view for the genealogy of the subject, Seth points out that new knowledges do not just enter the heads of people to permeate it with new ideas, but also serve to produce a new subject. Arguing that modern knowledge creates a knowing subject who is set apart from the objects to be known, he points out that the subject in this once novel conception of knowledge was not already present, but had to be created through new pedagogic practices and disciplines created by industrialization, capitalism, modern armies, and the modern novel. So in order for this reorientation to succeed, students need resources to supplement and enrich their learning. And this exigency hopefully will shape the blueprint of academic publishing in India today. Unsurprisingly, these newer resources and solutions might depend more heavily on the digital environment rather than that of print, which, while posing difficult challenges for work in Indic languages, contribute to an emergent model of humanities scholarship somewhat different from that in the global north. And drawing on some of the talks that we heard earlier this morning, there are some areas in which I feel there needs to be more attention paid in an Indian context, and one is definitely that of public history, cultural heritage, social justice. And there are now kind of many digital projects that address this. What I have found quite fascinating, so this is a project called Around DH in 80 Days, which was done 2 years ago, in which we tried to map digital humanities projects largely outside the global north. I mean, obviously there's still quite a few represented here, but we tried to kind of cast our net as widely as possible. And while we were doing the research for this project, we realized that many of the projects that were coming out of the global south were actually not hosted at academic institutions. In fact, the only one in India that I think is Shukanta Chaudhary's Bichitra. But I do feel that there's something really interesting happening with regards to the kind of projects that people are doing, again, for the love of knowledge and the spreading of culture. So this is Rikta, which is the biggest Urdu poetry library of its kind. It was actually created by the person who, Sanjeev Saraf, who actually is responsible for making plastic, like the equivalent of Tupperware. So he's a huge multi-billionaire in India who loves poetry, and he put this together. It's a complete labor of love, and he has a 35-member team, and it's very, as you can see, very well presented. It's transliterated into English, Hindi, and Urdu. And it's a wonderful resource, but is not an academic resource, so to speak. Another similar project is the Indian Memory Project, which relies a lot on crowdsourced material. It started out as a way of archiving our photographic history by looking at personal photographs that families would contribute, and they'd often send small vignettes about the photographs alongside, which is just kind of a wonderful social, cultural history of India that has been basically spearheaded by one person, Anusha Yadav, who is a photographer in her own right. Moving on, Umang is again not based at an academic institution, but it's a cross-border project that looks at Urdu and Urdu poetry and kind of poetry of resistance. But the other kind of the other aspect that I'd like to look at is the idea of looking at knowledge in different ways and drawing on kind of local contexts in order to do so. So this is a wonderful book by the aforementioned Tara Books, which is a study of what it means to be working in the museum and what a memory institution and a cultural heritage institution needs to be in order to make a difference to our civic life. But the examples used and the relationships sketched out are by artists, indigenous artists, whose work would not be traditionally seen in a museum. And it kind of draws on their perceptions of what a museum can be and what a museum should be. And I think it's a wonderful example of how cultural specificity can shape the ways that we might think of knowledge, even though those ideas might be received from Western contexts. I think another question that these conversations have raised, and I problematized the idea of the book yesterday and kind of asked, what is it like to be a book? And now I'm also kind of wondering, what is it like to be an archive, especially if you're a digital book? And what is the difference? What is the difference between a digital book and an archive, especially since we can kind of dive deep into the digital book and use different ways in which to explode its knowledge in a rhizomatic way? So this is a great example of academic publishing, I feel, which it's based in America, and I really feel that it could be emulated. It's obviously debates in digital humanities, but it's free to use. It can be annotated by anyone who logs in, and it's just a wonderful way of exploring the book object while retaining the format of the book in really interesting ways. So, and it's a great teaching tool as well. So it's just a model of how the electronic book could look, or the digital book. This is another wonderful project, which was a live written open draft, which I think for most academics is actually terrifying. And I think that the authors who participated in this are clearly very confident. But they wrote it they wrote it live as it happened. And they would have arguments, they would have kind of disagreements and kind of reinterpretations all occurring while the book was being conceived. And it's a 3-author project, which meant that it was there were quite a few disagreements. But again, it's a wonderful experiment. And I think we would benefit from seeing more work like this. They do have a business model in place as well. I mean, it is available in print. The book is available in print, which one is welcome to buy, but you're also welcome to just access the open access version for free. And so this is the actual, if you wish to buy it, the web page. I think many in the audience are familiar with Arthur Atwell's Paperwrite, which kind of converted copy shops in Africa into little print-on-demand outfits. And I think it would be really wonderful to see similar initiatives in India, especially in the light of the cases that are being fought against photocopying in India and the fact that photocopying is ostensibly eating into the budgets eating into the profits of large academic publishers. I have it on the authority of one of the lawyers fighting the case that is very much not the case. It's very negligible, the difference being made to those profits. And I feel that it might be constructive to have publishers working with students and teachers rather than against them. Especially in the current financial climate. I'd just like to end by talking a little bit about the Digital Humanities Manifesto and looking in particular at a certain point, which is that one of the ways in which digital humanities defines itself is qualitative, interpretive, experiential, emotive, and generative, and admittedly has a utopian core. But what it also aims to do is to privilege sharing of knowledge and generating knowledge through partnerships, which is very different from what we've come to know from the single author monograph, which is a kind of quite an enlightenment idea that we have inherited and don't really challenge. So I'd like to end by quoting Audre Lorde: "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And I think we as South Asian scholars have used the monograph and the academic book to our advantage, and to both professionally and in terms of knowledge. But I think the time has come to create new tools that belong to us and we can hopefully share with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Padmini. Fantastic. And an amazing place to end with some sort of challenge, really, to the way that we think about the monograph and the academic book. So much to think about. I'm just going to throw this open, really, to questions. We've got... we should have about 25 minutes for questions now. So plenty of time for discussion of both papers. So who would like to start off?
Yeah, I loved both papers. I thought they were very energetic, exciting, forward-looking, and a great way to kind of end this. But I had a question for Padmini. I find what you said about the Bengali blogosphere, it seemed very creative, very exciting, very generative. And what worries me about that is the whole issue of continuity, digital preservation, and there's always this issue, isn't there, in scholarship, where you want to have something stable to refer to because that's what anchors your discussions. And yet you also want to have, collaborative editing and collaborative work. And I wonder if you could comment on that tension between those things, because I've never been able to resolve it in my own head. I'm completely schizophrenic about it.
Thanks so much, Marilyn. Yes, actually, I should have probably mentioned that I have this data because Tanmay presented at a conference that Abhijit and I hosted on digitization and archiving. And the thrust of his paper was that now that we have these blogs, what do we do about preserving them? And he actually set out a schema by which he thought they needed to be archived, because exactly what you're saying, that there's no point in all of these wonderful generative conversations happening if we can't point back to them as a point of reference. I do understand your anxiety about kind of collaborative writing, and which is why I feel that the Debate in Digital Humanities book is really interesting and kind of tries its best to resolve that tension, because the primary text is the primary text. That is not fluid. But whatever commentary or whatever conversations one has around the text, just in the way that people addressed each other in marginalia, can still go forward. But the text itself remains very, very static. And many of the scholars who have published in that book have their own blogs and their own fora in which they've extended those conversations, or even use it as a tool of teaching, where they've had conversations with students elsewhere on course blogs, etc. So I do think that there is a place for a text, an inviolable text, but I feel like there should also be the facility to annotate or gloss or converse with other scholars.
Hi, my question's for Abhijit, because you mentioned that Jadavpur University is publishing both Bengali and English works. And I'm wondering, how do you, are they kept separate? What kind of conversations do they have between languages? Because till now, what we have seen is that linguistic literary cultures, both academic and non-academic, kind of tend to remain separated. It's only now with Penguin Hindi and HarperCollins Hindi that we're seeing something happening.
Well, I mean, there is also what I perhaps did not mention, because again, are we also attempting to do bilingual editions, for instance? We have done one with a book of Nepali oral form called Tamang Selo. It's kind of a sang genre. So we have done a bilingual edition in English translation and Nepali, and we are this is the only book which we have. No, there's another one which we have done in 3 languages, in fact, but that is a Bengali translation of Virgil's Aeneid, which we have a trilingual Latin, English, and Bengali apparatus. So
overkill.
One of the things which we do wish to do as a kind of dialogue is translations between Indian languages, and that is something which I think has been a very significant lack. We have, for instance, we have read Tamil literature or Gujarati literature through English translations. So again, the translations across Indian languages, and it's in this, and I say this. Bengal has been particularly remiss in this regard, because other Indian languages have translated Bengali literature into Gujarati, Tamil, and so on. But we have not returned the compliment. So I've begun to explore possibilities of doing a series of translations from Indian classics in other Indian languages. So again, but as I said, we are very small, and these are things which we're trying to address one at a time. And in many ways, we're just still playing in the sandbox. Work in progress, as it were.
Standing in the way of the next question. But I wanted to add to what Abhijit was saying by saying that besides these transactions across languages within the book, I mean, the total academic discourse on Indian campuses is highly bilingual or multilingual. You see, the same scholars, the same students are accessing both the English and Bengali books. And certainly the research and even the classroom teaching is taking account of material in both languages. So it's not as though there are sort of 2 separate kind of detached lines of publication. See, it's all part of a single integrated program. I think Abhijit will bear me out on that.
Yes.
But to actually kind of respond to that, something, again, kind of the holy grail to me is creating indexes that would take multilingual content and English content side by side. So, for example, Bottala, which is the kind of the area of Calcutta in which much book production happens, a lot of our knowledge about and a lot of the research done on that have been done by wonderful amateur citizen scholars, and much of that work exists in Bengali. But if we wanted that content to be searchable alongside the English content and possibly even Hindi or Marathi content, that would be amazing. And that's something I think we really need to work towards, where our kind of apparatus stretches across the languages. But that's a bit of a pipe dream.
Well, it's not so much of a pipe dream, because in the realm of book history, for instance, there's now an initiative to, again, I mean, it's to translate non-English. Again, I mean, I know this is very loaded, but let us say book history scholarship in non-English languages into English to facilitate that kind of search. Of course, you might say that we're privileging English again as a kind of linked language, but you have to start somewhere. Yeah. So, for example, I think right now the year before last there were Russian book history articles translated into English. This year, I think there's several Latvian as well as East European languages. Yeah. So this is an ongoing project which book historians are trying to come to terms with. And next up is, in fact, South Asian book history in South Asian languages translated into English. But it's proving to be a rather fractious project, and people disagreeing violently on whether they're at all a nation, at all something called you could think of a national book history. But that's a different argument for another day.
Thank you. Can I chip in here with a quick question? I was quite. I think in both of you pointed to problems with the monograph. Abhijit said that this is a form that doesn't make money, and therefore you don't favour this as a form of publication. Is that? I mean, you would choose to avoid it a bit.
No. I would publish the monograph, but perhaps not in a print, with a print run of 500 as we tend to do. We're still doing it.
Right.
In fact, that is in a sense also the authors expect that.
Right.
But it is proving difficult for a small press such as ours to sell, because our distribution is really Achilles' heel. We have to depend on large distributors. For instance, 2 of our titles are distributed by Orient Black Swan, but they also take a very large percentage of the sale. So, I mean, it would be much easier for us to distribute online, to sell online, and make changes if necessary to text can be more fluid. We can also, for example, the last monograph that we published was on water bodies in Calcutta. It's called 5,000 Mirrors, Water Bodies on Calcutta. There's a huge amount of photographs, tables, graphs, and so on and forth. So again, it is easy to see how this kind of material could be presented much more dynamically with multimedia in an online version. But again, as I said, we do intend to do this, but it'll take a bit of time because we are also teaching ourselves. I mean, I'm a book historian, but I was not trained as a publisher. So in a sense, much of this is also a learning curve for a few of us. And so we're sort of learning as we go along. So as long as we have this sort of time, 5 or 6 years, whatever it takes us to reach that point where we can confidently say that this is going to be the direction of the next 4 or 5 years, I think we'd be happy with that, but we are still in that process.
Thank you. And Padmini, you sort of pointed to more sort of maybe bigger ideological or sociological problems with this as a form, because actually, you're saying that actually more collective models are, to your mind, the way of the future. Is that kind of what you're arguing for?
I'm not saying that the monograph shouldn't exist. All I'm saying is that the kind of status that it has is possibly a bit overdetermined, and I think that that's because of reasons of professional advancement and so on and so forth. And I also feel like when we say the monograph, I mean the example that Abhijit just cited, I mean if that book was to go online, that would be a monograph, but a digital edition of a monograph has a different kind of cachet, I think, than the way that we think of the print monograph. And also, I think the crossover title has more appeal and kind of ensures that scholarship gets out there in a way that I feel is important. So because I feel like it generates more interest in the subject.
Yeah, and it's just interesting to see that sort of theme coming through. That there's some tensions with this form, really. Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions? Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Abhijit, I'm just a writer. I don't know much about distribution. For distribution, why? And I'm against globalization also, by the way. But Amazon Books is a globalized distribution network.
Yes.
Don't you use them?
We have tried to. We are in the process of setting up we try to selling through Flipkart. But you see, as a university, because we're not a commercial body, the university press is a part of university. The kind of paperwork that one has to provide for organization like Flipkart, I mean, it's not an insuperable difficulty, but it has taken us a lot of time. The kind of, for example, the business credentials that they require, and to explain to Flipkart that we are not a profit-making organization, we are a part of a university, so therefore we do not have something which is called a TAN, a taxation something number. The university simply doesn't have it. So this conversation took quite a while, and Amazon, in fact, the conversation didn't go very far. Flipkart is an Indian e-portal, and we'll soon be selling through that. But it's not proven to be a very easy task to actually fulfill all the conditions that they laid out. I mean, the kind of financial documents that we had to provide. So again, I mean, none of us are experts and also the university itself is hesitant. I mean, we have to sort of go through the finance office, ask permission for whether we can sell online. This is something which is new for Indian universities. And what would be best is if we could sell online ourselves, but we still don't have a mechanism to collect payments online.
Yeah, Sham, yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. I hope I can take your course online, Padmini. that will be the ultimate in digital humanities if I'm sitting in Cape Town.
It would be, yes.
I'm sort of agnostic about the digital humanities because I'm still learning. I'm fairly quite traditional about the book, but it reminded me about the manuscript actually, because these manuscripts had interlinear glosses and marginalia, and they were flowing, and often as I said, you don't know the author, and we had to work that out. So there was something that resembled a preprint type of scholarship in a certain way. But the night before the start of this conference, I read an interview with Franco Moretti in the LA Review of Books, and I can distribute it to everyone. And he just completely, as they say, dissed the digital humanities. And he says, I don't know if you've seen this interview with him, he says, digital humanities hasn't produced a single big idea. So I don't know if this is the purpose of digital humanities. I'm converted a bit after this session. I was yeah. For me, it's totally utilitarian. I mean, what can it do? It seems to him it's about big data and computational stylistics, blah blah blah. Do you think that it ought to produce a big idea, a big break?
I think it's fascinating that Moretti, of all people, should say this, because he was the person who came up with the idea of distant reading, which is a way of looking at big data. So he's effectively saying, now that I've given you the big idea, there is no more space for any other big ideas. So it's curious that Moretti should be taking that position. But yes, I do think there is space for big ideas, if you like, but not from digital humanities as we've come to understand it so far. So just very, very kind of brief prehistory. I think DH, in its kind of institutional contexts, how it emerged was humanities computing, King's College being one of the most important places that happened. And a lot of the work that's happened in humanities computing and then latterly DH has been around textual corpuses. So, Bichitra is an example of this. Lots of TEI, Textual Encoding Initiative work. But I feel that the big lacunae in this area is the relationship between design, interface, form, format, and humanities scholarship, which is, if you think about it, what we do as book historians as well. And because the degree that I'm launching is in a design school, I think that's kind of the position that we're taking, that going forward as these, as digitality becomes more ubiquitous and the device is so more ubiquitous, we need to be optimizing our experiences. I think at the moment, many of us compromise on our use of the internet, in that the internet gives us a very compromised experience, advertisements or pop-up things, or, we are dictated to by the people who are providing these technologies, but we in turn are not educating ourselves enough as users to create our own technologies, our own alternatives, and much of those shifts will happen, I think, by looking at interface and design, and looking, for us in India, for example, looking at different ways in which we look at design, looking at older formats of books, or the way that the cover. And I was going to show you this, but I forgot. It's like a story box. So it's a box that opens out, and it has like panels in which people narrate. So it's a mnemonic device to tell a story. And so that mode of storytelling is something that can be transposed into a digital environment. So it's kind of looking at different ways in which cultures tell stories or disseminate knowledge and transposing them into a digital environment that I feel like has a future. So, yeah.
May I add a certain, not
please.
relevant to that, and something I did not want to bring up in this paper, but I think I should also make this additional point that, along with producing, scholarly editions and so on and forth, what has also been lacking in the Indian publishing market was training for would-be editors and publishers. So, if you want good books, you also need good copy editors. You need people who are trained in producing good copy. So one of the things which the School of Cultural Texts and Records, when Professor Shukant Jyoti set it up in 2003, one of the things we started, and I think was probably the first ever editing and publishing course in the country, which has now been running for 13 years. So it was an after-hours course where we trained young graduates fairly rigorously in copy editing and some lectures on publishing. And in fact, now in 13 years' time, most of them have occupied the middle and high-ranking positions of most English language publishers, especially based in New Delhi. So I think that is also a part, which of our mandate of creating, producing knowledge, is that you also need adequately trained publishers. And now, of course, Seagull runs a very, well-regarded course. There are courses run by the National Book Trust, as well as universities such as Ambedkar University and others have begun courses in editing and publishing. But this has been very much a feature of the last 10 years or so, and consequent upon the entry of overseas publishers into India post-liberalization 1991-92. So the demand for trained publishers and copy editors began to be felt, and the supply is still not enough for the demand, and we can't, every year we are asked by publishers from Delhi to for good copy editors, and we always fall short. So there is a tremendous scope for this kind of training which can be given, and which could be a very indispensable part of bookmaking, both in print and digital formats.
Well, thank you so much. Wonderful papers. Yeah.